She thought the glass house would be their final mistake, the last foolish decision of two people who had already lost everything they'd worked for over 50 years. But what Dorothy and Harold discovered inside those transparent walls wasn't just shelter, it was a secret architectural masterpiece worth $80 million, hidden in plain sight while the world dismissed it as a worthless oddity. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the darkness at 4:30 in the morning, just like it had every day for the past 3 years. Harold rolled over in the narrow bed, his 72-year-old joints protesting every movement. Beside him, Dorothy stirred, her silver hair catching the pale light from the street lamp outside their cramped studio apartment. "Morning already?" she whispered, though she knew the answer. Harold kissed her forehead gently. "Morning, love. Time to make another $1." Dorothy had been married to Harold for 49 years. And in all that time, she'd never seen him complain. Not when the factory closed and took his pension with it. Not when their savings evaporated during Dorothy's cancer treatments 5 years ago. Not when they'd been forced to sell their little house with the yellow shutters and move into this one-room apartment above the Korean barbecue restaurant where the smell of kimchi clung to everything they owned. Harold dressed quietly in the dark worn jeans, a flannel shirt Dorothy had patched twice, steel-toed boots that had seen better decades. At 72, he was the oldest man on the construction crew, but his hands were steady and his back was strong enough to carry the work that younger men couldn't be bothered to finish properly. The job paid $12 an hour with no benefits, but it was work, and Harold had learned long ago that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. Dorothy watched him go, then lay in bed for exactly 5 more minutes, her one daily luxury, before rising to begin her own routine. She dressed in a sweater that had belonged to her mother and pants she'd bought at the thrift store 3 summers ago. The fabric was thin now, soft from countless washings, but it was clean and it covered her, and that was enough. Then she gathered her weapons, a worn spiral notebook filled with carefully recorded prices from every grocery store within a 10-mile radius, a fistful of coupons cut from newspapers she found in the apartment building's recycling bin, and a calculator with numbers worn smooth from constant use. Dorothy had turned poverty into an art form, a careful dance of timing and strategy that could make $23 feed them for a week. The grocery store opened at 6. Dorothy would be there at 5:58, first in line, armed with a battle plan that could stretch rice and beans into a dozen different meals, that could turn a clearance chicken into soup that would last 3 days. She knew every sales cycle, every markdown schedule, every trick to make poverty look less like poverty and more like careful budgeting. She had memorized the schedule of when bread went half price, when produce got marked down, when the butcher wrapped up yesterday's meat for quick sale. She knew which cashier would let coupons slide past their expiration date and which manager would approve price matches without asking too many questions. It was survival disguised as shopping, and Dorothy had become an expert. On this particular Tuesday morning in November, Dorothy stood in the cereal aisle, comparing unit prices on a calculator whose battery was dying when her phone rang. The sound startled her. Their phone rarely rang except for bill collectors or wrong numbers. She fumbled in her purse, embarrassed by the loud tone echoing through the quiet store. "Mrs. Harold." The voice was crisp, professional. "This is Dorothy, Mrs. Dorothy. This is Patricia Goldberg from Goldberg and Associates. I'm an estate attorney in Sacramento. I have some unusual news regarding your late great-aunt, Margaret Holloway." Dorothy's hands shook slightly as she gripped the phone. She remembered Margaret vaguely, an odd woman who'd lived alone somewhere in Northern California, who sent birthday cards with $5 bills tucked inside, and who everyone in the family whispered about but never actually visited. Dorothy's mother had always spoken of Margaret in hushed tones, calling her peculiar and too independent for her own good, I'm sorry to hear she passed," Dorothy said carefully, moving her cart to the side so other shoppers could pass. "Mrs. Dorothy, your great-aunt, left you something in her will. Well, it's unconventional. She's left you a house." Dorothy's breath caught. "A house?" "Yes, though I should warn you, it's not what most people would consider desirable real estate. It's in a very remote area, and the structure itself is unusual, made almost entirely of glass. Most of the family members she contacted weren't interested. The property taxes are current, but there are no utilities connected to the property, and frankly, most people consider it worthless." Dorothy stared at the cereal boxes in front of her, not seeing them. A house, any house, even a strange one, even a worthless one. After 3 years of living in a studio apartment where they could hear every footstep from the family upstairs and every argument from the couple next door, the word house sounded like a miracle. "Can we see it?" she asked. "Of course. I have to warn you, though it's quite remote, no neighbors within 5 miles. The structure is, well, you'll see. It was built by your great-aunt's late husband, an architect who had some very unusual ideas about residential design." That afternoon, Dorothy sat at their small kitchen table, really just a card table wedged between the refrigerator and the bed with the property documents spread in front of her. Harold leaned over her shoulder, reading the description aloud. "Glass house, approximately 3,000 square feet, built 1976, located on 12 acres of undeveloped land in Mendocino County. No neighbors within 5 miles. Property described as experimental residential structure with non-traditional building methods." He looked at the accompanying photographs. The house appeared to emerge from the hillside like a crystalline growth, all angles and transparency, surrounded by tall grass and scrub oak. It looked like something from a science fiction movie, beautiful and completely impractical. "Dorothy," he said gently, "it looks like a greenhouse. How would we heat it? How would we have any privacy? What would we do for water, for electricity?" Dorothy stared at the photos. She could see through the glass walls to the interior, could see how the structure seemed to float above the landscape rather than dominate it. It was unlike anything she'd ever imagined living in, and yet something about it called to her. "Harold, our rent here just went up to $1,800 a month. We can't afford it. In 3 months, we'll be homeless anyway." Harold was quiet for a long time. He looked around their cramped apartment, the bed that folded down from the wall, the tiny kitchen where Dorothy performed daily miracles with ingredients that cost almost nothing, the single window that looked out onto a brick wall covered in graffiti. "Dorothy, we know nothing about living off the grid. We're 70 years old. What if something goes wrong? What if one of us gets sick?" Dorothy picked up the photograph of the glass house and studied it more carefully. The structure seemed to capture the light, to hold it and transform it. Even in the faded photograph, she could see how the building seemed to glow from within. "Harold, what if something goes right?" she said quietly. "What? If this is exactly what we need, even if we don't understand it yet?" He reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was thin now, marked with age spots and the small scars of a lifetime spent working with her hands, but her grip was strong, and when she looked at him with that expression, the one that had convinced him to marry her 49 years ago, the one that had gotten them through every crisis since he knew the decision was already made. "When do you want to drive up and see it?" he asked. Saturday morning found them in their 1998 Honda Civic, driving north through the coastal mountains. The car had over 200,000 miles on it and burned oil, but the engine ran smooth and the heat worked most of the time. They'd packed a thermos of coffee and sandwiches made from day-old bread and lunch meat Dorothy had bought marked down. The property was 3 hours from anywhere that could reasonably be called a town. They drove through redwood, forests, and past rolling hills covered in vineyards, then turned onto smaller roads that wound through mountains where cell phone service disappeared, and the only signs of civilization were occasional mailboxes standing like sentinels beside unmarked driveways. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Harold asked, consulting the hand-drawn map the attorney had provided. Their GPS had given up trying to locate them somewhere back near the last gas station. "According to this map, we turn left at the big oak tree with the lightning scar," Dorothy said, squinting at the crude drawing. "There, I think that's it." They turned onto a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The Honda bounced and scraped over ruts and potholes while branches scraped against the windows. After 2 miles of rough driving, the road opened into a clearing. "There," Dorothy pointed ahead. "I think that's it." The glass house sat in the clearing like something that had fallen from the sky. In the late afternoon light, it seemed to glow from within, its transparent walls reflecting the surrounding forest in fractured, beautiful patterns. It was bigger than the photos had suggested, multi-leveled, with sections that cantilevered out over the sloping hillside. Harold parked the car, and they sat in silence, staring. "It's not what I expected," Dorothy finally said. "What did you expect?" She smiled ruefully. "Something worthless." They walked around the perimeter first, like cautious animals, circling something they didn't understand. The structure was supported by steel beams, painted a dark green, that seemed to disappear among the oak trees. Most of the walls were glass, not windows, but actual walls made of glass panels fitted together with remarkable precision. Some panels were clear, others tinted in subtle shades of green and blue that seemed to change color as they moved. The foundation was made of local stone, fitted together without mortar, in a way that made it seem like the building had grown from the hillside itself. The roof was a complex arrangement of glass and steel that followed the slope of the land, rising and falling in sections that seemed to follow no architectural rules Dorothy had ever seen. "Look at this," Harold called from what appeared to be the front entrance. "The lock's been changed. There's a new key." He held up a brass key that had been taped to the doorframe, along with a note written in spidery handwriting. "For Dorothy, live beautifully. Love, Aunt Margaret." Dorothy's throat tightened as she read the note. She had barely known Margaret, had seen her maybe 5 times in her entire life, at family gatherings where the older woman had sat quietly in corners, observing rather than participating. But Margaret had remembered her, had thought of her, had left her this strange gift. Harold fitted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the heavy glass door swung open with a soft sigh. Inside, the house was a cathedral of light. The afternoon sun streamed through the glass walls, casting rainbow patterns across polished concrete floors. The space was open and flowing, with levels connected by floating staircases that seemed to hang in the air without visible support. There was no traditional furniture, just built-in benches and surfaces that seemed to grow from the structure itself. Dorothy walked through the space slowly, her footsteps echoing. The interior was larger than their entire apartment building, but it didn't feel overwhelming. Instead, it felt peaceful, like being inside a piece of music, made visible. "Harold, look at this." In what might have been the kitchen, there were spaces clearly designed for appliances, but everything was integrated into the glass and steel framework. Counters appeared to be carved from single pieces of stone. Storage spaces were built into the walls, their glass fronts revealing empty shelves waiting to be filled. They moved through the house like tourists in a museum, afraid to touch anything. The floors were heated by radiant tubing embedded in the concrete. Dorothy could feel the warmth through the soles of her shoes. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by steel beams that seemed too delicate to hold so much glass and sky. "It's like living inside a piece of art," Harold murmured. They climbed a spiral staircase to the upper level, where what might have been bedrooms were defined not by walls but by changes in floor level and ceiling height. Through the glass, they could see for miles rolling hills covered in oak and madrone, a sliver of ocean in the distance, hawks circling overhead. "Dorothy," Harold said quietly, "I think your great-aunt might have been an artist." "Her husband was an architect," Dorothy said, remembering fragments of family stories. "He died young, and she lived here alone for almost 50 years. As they explored, the sun began to set, and the house transformed. The glass walls seemed to capture and amplify the golden light, making the entire structure glow like a lantern. Colors shifted across the surfaces: amber, rose, deep purple. It was breathtaking and completely impractical, and unlike anything either of them had ever seen. The house had no conventional heating system that they could identify. No air conditioning, no obvious electrical panels or utility connections. Yet it didn't feel empty or abandoned. It felt expectant, like it had been waiting for them. In what might have been a study, they found shelves lined with books on architecture, sustainable living, and organic gardening. A desk sat positioned to take advantage of northern light, streaming through a perfectly placed window. On the desk, another note in Margaret's handwriting: "The house will teach you how to live in it. Be patient. Listen." Dorothy picked up one of the books, a manual on solar power systems. She flipped through pages covered with Margaret's careful notes in the margins, diagrams and calculations that suggested decades of learning and adaptation. Harold, she didn't just live here. She studied how to live here. They found evidence of Margaret's presence everywhere. A bedroom where the bed was positioned to catch morning light. A bathroom where skylights eliminated the need for artificial lighting during the day. A kitchen designed around natural ventilation that would keep food cool in summer and warm in winter. But it was the garden that convinced Dorothy this might actually work. Behind the house, terraced into the hillside, were the remains of what had once been an elaborate vegetable garden. Even neglected and overgrown, Dorothy could see the intelligence of its design: raised beds positioned to catch maximum sun, a drip irrigation system fed by rainwater collection, fruit trees planted to provide shade in summer and light in winter. "Look at this," she called to Harold, kneeling beside a raised bed where volunteer tomatoes were still producing fruit despite having received no care for months. "This soil is incredible," Harold joined her, scooping up a handful of dark, rich earth that smelled like life itself. "It's like compost, but it's everywhere." 50 years of organic gardening, Dorothy said softly. She built this. As they walked through the garden in the fading light, Dorothy began to understand something about her great-aunt that no one in the family had ever mentioned. Margaret hadn't been hiding from the world in this glass house. She'd been learning how to live in harmony with it. They drove home that night in thoughtful silence. The Honda's heater barely worked, and Dorothy pulled her coat tighter around herself as they wound through the dark mountains. "What are you thinking?" Harold finally asked. Dorothy stared out at the passing trees, black silhouettes against a star-filled sky she hadn't seen clearly in years of city living. "I'm thinking that everyone who told us it was worthless never actually looked at it. They just saw a glass house and decided it couldn't be lived in. Can it be lived in? I don't know. But Harold, I can't stop thinking about that light. Did you see how it changed as the sun moved? How it filled every corner?" Harold nodded. "It was like being inside a rainbow." "We've been living in shadows for 3 years, Dorothy said quietly. "In that apartment, we never see the sky except for that one window that looks at a brick wall. We don't know what the weather's doing until we go outside. We can't tell what time it is without looking at a clock. In the glass house, you could see everything," Harold said, understanding what she meant. "The sunrise, the sunset, the seasons changing, the weather coming. Maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need to remember what it's like to live with the world instead of hiding from it." Back in their studio apartment, they lay in bed listening to the sounds of the city sirens, late-night traffic, their neighbor's television through the thin walls. Dorothy stared at the ceiling, thinking about the house on the hill, where the only sounds had been wind and birdsong. The attorney said no utilities. Harold said in the darkness, "No power, no water, no sewer. There's a well, I saw the pump house, and there were solar panels on the roof. Did you notice them? No heat. There's a wood-burning fireplace in the center of the main room. And Harold, with all that glass, it might trap solar heat during the day." Harold turned toward her. "Dorothy, are you seriously considering this?" She was quiet for so long he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she said, "I'm seriously considering that we don't have any other choice, and maybe, That's not a bad thing. What do you mean? I mean, we've been trying to live the way we used to live, in the world we used to know, but that world doesn't exist anymore. Our house is gone. Harold's job at the factory is gone. Our savings are gone. Maybe we need to learn a different way to live. Harold listened to the sound of their upstairs neighbor walking across the floor, heavy footsteps that shook their ceiling and rattled their windows. It would be quiet, he said finally. It would be ours. The next morning, Dorothy called the attorney and asked more detailed questions about the property. The taxes were $800 a year less than they spent on groceries in 6 weeks. The well had been tested recently, and the water was clean. The septic system was functioning. The solar power system was old but operational. There's one more thing, Patricia Goldberg said. Your great-aunt left some money for property maintenance, about $15,000. It's designated for upkeep, repairs, that sort of thing. Dorothy almost dropped the phone. $15,000 was more money than they'd had at one time in 3 years. Mrs. Dorothy, I have to ask, are you seriously considering living there? It's very remote, very unconventional. Most people your age would find it quite challenging. Most people our age have other options, Dorothy said. We don't. That afternoon, Harold called his crew chief and explained the situation. The man listened without comment, then said, Harold, you've been working construction for 40 years. You know more about building and fixing than guys half your age. If anyone can make a place like that work, it's you. What if we can't? Then you'll figure something else out. But Harold, what if you can? Dorothy made her own calls to their landlord, to the electric company, to the few people who would need to know they were leaving. Each conversation felt like cutting a rope that had been holding them underwater. That night, they sat at their kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists, pros and cons, practical considerations, costs and benefits. But in the end, the decision came down to something simpler than logic. We can't afford to stay here, Harold said. The rent increase means we'll be spending more than we make. We'll be homeless anyway in 6 months. Dorothy nodded. When I was in that house, Harold, for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Like there was space for something more than just getting through each day. It might be the biggest mistake we've ever made, or it might be the best thing we've ever done. Harold looked at his wife of 49 years, at her silver hair and the lines around her eyes that mapped decades of worry and determination. She'd followed him through job losses and financial disasters, through sickness and setbacks, never complaining, always finding a way to make do with less. When do you want to do this? He asked. Dorothy smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in months. As soon as possible. Before we lose our nerve. Friday morning, Harold gave his crew chief 2 weeks' notice. Dorothy told their landlord they'd be out by the end of the month. They began the enormous task of sorting through 49 years of accumulated possessions, deciding what could come with them to a house made of glass. We can't take much, Harold said, looking around their cramped apartment. Glass houses aren't made for heavy furniture or lots of stuff. Dorothy picked up a small ceramic bird that had belonged to her grandmother, one of the few things she'd managed to keep through all their moves and downsizing. Maybe that's not a bad thing, she said. Maybe we've been carrying too much weight anyway. Their friends and neighbors thought they'd lost their minds. Mrs. Park from downstairs shook her head sadly when Dorothy told her their plans. Glass house in the middle of nowhere. Dorothy, you're 70 years old. What if you get sick? What if Harold gets hurt? There's no one to help you out there. Dorothy's response surprised even herself. Mrs. Park, we've been sick here. We've been hurt here. And there's been no one to help us anyway. At least out there, we'll have space to heal. Young Mr. Kim from the apartment next door was more direct. You're making a huge mistake. Glass houses are cold. They're impossible to heat. You'll freeze to death in the winter. Maybe, Dorothy said. But we've been freezing here too. At least there we'll be freezing somewhere beautiful. As moving day approached, Harold felt a mixture of terror and anticipation that reminded him of being young. He couldn't remember the last time he'd made a decision based on hope rather than necessity. It was frightening and exhilarating, like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there would be water below. Dorothy felt something she'd almost forgotten. Excitement. For months, she'd been moving through her days like someone walking underwater. Everything muffled and gray. But now she woke up thinking about morning light streaming through glass walls, about having space to think and breathe and maybe even dream again. The moving truck was smaller than Harold had expected. Most of their possessions would go to charity or the dump. What remained fit into boxes that could be carried by 2 people. Clothes suitable for a simpler life, books they couldn't bear to part with, a few kitchen items, Dorothy's sewing machine, Harold's basic tools, and the small things that held memories too precious to abandon. As they loaded the Honda for the last time, Dorothy felt lighter than she had in years. Not just because they owned less, but because for the first time in a long time, they were moving towards something instead of running away from something. Their neighbor, Mr. Kim, came out to say goodbye, still shaking his head. "You sure about this?" he asked Harold. "Glass house sounds cold, lonely." Harold looked at Dorothy, who was carefully placing the ceramic bird in a box cushioned with her grandmother's quilts. "Mr. Kim," he said, "we've been cold and lonely in apartments with regular walls. At least this way, we'll be cold and lonely somewhere beautiful." The drive north felt different this time. They weren't visiting anymore. They were moving toward their future. Harold gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as they turned onto the dirt road, realizing that in a few hours, this rough track would be their driveway, their connection to the world. "What if we can't make it work?" Dorothy asked, as they bounced over ruts and potholes. "Then we'll figure something else out," Harold replied. "But Dorothy, what if we can?" When they rounded the final curve and the glass house came into view, the afternoon sun was hitting it at just the right angle to turn the entire structure into a prism. Light scattered across the hillside in brilliant colors, red, gold, blue, green, like the house was celebrating their arrival. Dorothy gasped. "Harold, it's welcoming us home." They parked the car and sat for a moment, looking at the place that would either be their salvation or their final adventure. The house stood transparent and gleaming in the late afternoon light, surrounded by tall grass and ancient oak, trees that seemed to embrace it rather than dwarf it. Then Harold took Dorothy's hand, and together they walked toward their future, transparent and gleaming and full of light. That night, they slept on an air mattress in the center of the main room, surrounded by boxes and covered with every blanket they owned. Through the glass ceiling, they could see more stars than either of them had ever seen in their lives, millions of them scattered across the clear country sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Listen," Dorothy whispered. Harold listened. The silence was so complete it felt like being inside a prayer. No sirens, no traffic, no television through thin walls. Just the sound of wind in the oak trees and their own breathing, and the soft settling sounds of a house that had been waiting 40 years for them to come home. "I think we did the right thing," Harold said. Dorothy reached over and found his hand in the darkness. "Ask me in 6 months." But even as she said it, lying there, in their transparent house with starlight streaming through glass walls and the vast silence of the countryside wrapped around them like a blanket, Dorothy felt something she hadn't felt in years. The possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. Outside, the glass house glowed softly in the starlight, a beacon on the hillside, home to 2 people who had chosen hope over fear, beauty over safety, and the unknown over the unbearable. They had no idea they were sleeping inside a masterpiece. The first month in the glass house nearly broke them. November in Northern California was colder than Harold and Dorothy had expected, and the house, for all its ethereal beauty, was like living inside a crystalline refrigerator. Harold spent his days splitting firewood from fallen oak branches, learning to manage the wood-burning stove that seemed to be their only reliable source of heat. The fire needed constant attention, too little wood, and they shivered under layers of blankets too much, and the glass walls became opaque with condensation that turned their transparent sanctuary into a foggy prison. Dorothy discovered that a house made of glass offered absolutely no privacy from the outside world. Deer wandered right up to the walls and stared in at them eating breakfast, their large brown eyes curious and unblinking. A family of raccoons seemed to consider the house their personal entertainment center, pressing their tiny hands against the glass each evening like children at an aquarium. Watching Harold and Dorothy move through their nightly routines with apparent fascination. "We're living in a fishbowl," Dorothy muttered one morning, watching a young buck examine their breakfast table with intense curiosity. The deer stood less than 3 feet away, separated only by a panel of glass, close enough that she could see her own reflection in its dark eyes. "At least the fish are on the outside," Harold replied, though his smile was tired. His back ached from sleeping on the air mattress they'd placed directly on the heated concrete floor, and his hands were raw from hauling firewood and learning to operate systems he didn't understand. The solar power system worked, but barely. They had enough electricity for a few LED lights and Dorothy's sewing machine, but using anything else, a radio, a small television, even a coffee maker, meant the batteries would die before morning. They learned to live by the sun's schedule, rising with the light, doing all their tasks during daylight hours, and settling in for the night when darkness fell at 5 o'clock. Water came from the well, but it had to be pumped by hand because the electric pump required more power than their solar system could provide reliably. Harold spent an hour each morning filling containers that Dorothy would ration carefully throughout the day. They heated water for bathing in pots on the wood stove, taking turns washing with washcloths in what felt like a camping trip that might never end. "This is harder than I thought it would be," Dorothy admitted one evening as they sat close to the fire, sharing a dinner of canned soup heated on the wood stove and bread she'd baked in the stove's small oven. "I feel like a pioneer, but not in a romantic way." Harold nodded, poking at the fire with a stick he'd carved into a proper fire tool. "I keep thinking about our old apartment. How we could turn on lights without worrying about batteries. How we could take a hot shower whenever we wanted. How we could flush a toilet without pumping water first," Dorothy added with a rueful laugh. But even as they struggled with the practical realities of their new life, something unexpected was happening. Away from the noise and chaos of the city, away from the constant pressure of bills and landlords and survival, they were rediscovering each other and discovering things about the house that defied easy explanation. The light, for instance, behaved strangely inside the glass walls. Dorothy first noticed it on a morning when fog had settled in the valley, obscuring the view beyond the house. Instead of making the interior dim and gray, the fog seemed to amplify the light inside, creating a soft, even glow that filled every corner without casting shadows. "Harold?" she called from the kitchen area, where she was making coffee on their camp stove. "Come look at this." Harold joined her, following her gaze upward. Above them, the glass ceiling panels were somehow capturing and diffusing the weak morning light, spreading it throughout the space like a photographer's softbox. "How is it doing that?" Harold asked, studying the way the light seemed to bounce between panels, each surface reflecting and refracting until the entire house glowed like the inside of a pearl. "I don't know," Dorothy said. "But look, even though we can't see outside because of the fog, we have more light in here than we had in our apartment on the sunniest day." Harold examined the glass panels more carefully, running his hands along the edges where they met the steel framework. The joints were incredibly precise, fitted together with a craftsmanship that seemed almost impossible for 1976 technology. "Dorothy, look at this." He pointed to the corner where several panels came together. "These aren't standard building materials. This glass is different, thicker in some places, thinner in others, and these connections," he traced the metal framework with his finger. "They're custom made. Someone engineered every joint specifically for this building." As the days passed, they discovered other peculiarities. The house seemed to regulate its own temperature in ways that defied logic. On sunny days, even when it was cold outside, the interior became pleasantly warm by afternoon, as if the building were storing heat in its bones. At night, that warmth radiated slowly from the floors and walls, keeping them comfortable long after the fire had died down. "It's like the house is alive," Dorothy said one evening as they lay on their air mattress, watching stars appear through the glass ceiling, like it's breathing with the weather. The acoustics were equally mysterious. Sounds from outside birdsong, wind in the trees, distant thunder were somehow amplified and clarified, as if the glass walls were acting as some kind of natural amphitheater. But sounds from inside were muffled and contained, their conversations intimate and private despite the transparent walls. Dorothy began to notice how the positioning of various elements in the house seemed deliberately calculated. The kitchen faced east, catching morning light for breakfast preparation. The main living area faced south, maximizing warmth during the day. Even the bathroom, tucked discreetly into a corner where angled walls provided privacy without blocking light, seemed positioned to catch specific sun angles at specific times. Whoever designed this understood exactly how the sun moves across this particular hillside, she told Harold one afternoon as she watched afternoon light stream through panels that seemed positioned to illuminate a built-in reading nook at precisely the right time. For evening relaxation. More than that, Harold said, consulting a small notebook where he'd begun recording his observations. I've been timing things. The house gets natural light for reading until exactly 7:15 each night. The kitchen gets perfect light for cooking from 6 to 8 in the morning and again from 4 to 6 in the evening. That's not coincidence. Their situation became the talk of the small communities within driving distance. When they made their weekly trip to town for groceries and supplies, Dorothy could feel people staring, whispering. The checkout clerk at the tiny market asked pointed questions about whether they had heat, whether they felt safe, out there all alone. "You know," the woman said, as she rang up Dorothy's carefully planned purchases, "my cousin lives up that way, says she can see your house glowing at night, says it looks like a spaceship landed on the hill." Dorothy smiled politely. "It's quite beautiful at night. But how do you stay warm? How do you cook? My cousin says there's no power lines running out there. We're managing," Dorothy said simply, though she could see the woman's skepticism. At the hardware store, where Harold went to buy firewood and basic tools, the conversations were more direct. "You're the folks living in that glass house," said Pete Morrison, the store's owner. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Harold replied, selecting a better axe for splitting wood. "How's that working out for you?" Pete's tone suggested he already knew the answer. "We're learning," Harold said diplomatically. Pete shook his head. "I give you 2 months before you're back in town looking for an apartment. That place has been empty for 40 years for good reason. No one can live in a house made of windows." "Maybe no one's tried hard enough," Harold said quietly. But Pete had already turned to help another customer. The skepticism extended beyond casual encounters. Their former neighbors from the apartment called occasionally, and the conversations always followed the same pattern. "How are you holding up out there?" Mrs. Park would ask, her voice heavy with concern that bordered on disapproval. "We're doing well," Dorothy would reply. "Learning new things every day. But what about winter? What about storms? What if one of you gets sick?" Dorothy had stopped trying to explain that winter in the glass house was different than winter in a conventional house. That storms were spectacular rather than frightening, when you could see them approaching across the valley. That being connected to the rhythms of the natural world made them feel more aware of their bodies, not less. The mockery hurt, but it also strengthened their resolve. They'd been dismissed and overlooked for so long that the disapproval of others felt familiar, almost comfortable. What mattered was that they were surviving. And more than surviving, they were beginning to thrive in ways they hadn't anticipated. It was Dorothy who first noticed the signature. She'd been cleaning the glass panels, a daily task that had become almost meditative. The morning light revealed every smudge, every fingerprint, every speck of dust, and she'd developed a rhythm of washing and polishing that kept the walls transparent and gleaming. "Harold," she called, pausing with her squeegee in hand. "Come look at this." In the corner where 2 large panels met, etched into the glass itself in letters so small she'd almost missed them, was a signature. J. Holloway, architect, 1976. Harold examined the etching with a magnifying glass he'd bought for reading the tiny print on solar system manuals. "It's not scratched into the surface," he said. "It looks like it was etched when the glass was made. See how? The letters have the same depth and quality as the rest of the panel." Dorothy traced the letters with her finger. J. Holloway. That must be Margaret's husband, the architect who died young. But why sign the glass? Why not put a plaque somewhere, or sign the architectural drawings? Dorothy stepped back, looking at the signature in context. It was positioned where it would only be visible from inside the house, at a height where someone sitting in the built-in reading nook would notice it during late afternoon reading sessions. "Maybe he didn't want credit," she said. "Maybe he wanted the house itself to be the signature." That evening, Harold began what would become an obsession, researching James Holloway and the house they'd inherited. With their limited internet access, they could only use their phones for research during the brief periods when the solar batteries were fully charged. He began piecing together fragments of information. The local library, a 20-mile drive from the house, had a small collection of architectural books and access to newspaper archives. Harold spent hours there each week, slowly building a picture of the man who had designed their home. James Holloway had been 36 when he completed the glass house, already recognized as a rising star in sustainable architecture. His earlier buildings, a school in Marin County, an office complex in Sacramento, a community center in Davis, had won awards for their innovative use of natural lighting and passive solar heating. "Listen to this," Harold told Dorothy one evening, reading from a photocopied magazine article he'd found in the library's archives. "James Holloway's revolutionary approach to residential design challenges every assumption about how humans should live in relation to their environment. His buildings don't merely occupy space, they collaborate with it." Dorothy looked up from the sock she was mending by firelight. "Collaborate with it?" "That's what this says. Holloway's structures respond to weather, season, and time of day, as if they were living organisms rather than static objects. The result is architecture that enhances, rather than dominates, the natural world." Dorothy thought about this as she continued her mending. "That's exactly what this house does. It responds. In the morning, it captures light for the kitchen. In the evening, it holds warmth from the day. During storms, it frames the weather like a theater." Harold continued reading. The article says he believed that architecture should teach people how to live in harmony with natural cycles rather than isolate them from those cycles. "Is that what we're learning?" Dorothy asked. "How to live with natural cycles." Harold considered this. Since moving to the house, they'd become acutely aware of sunrise and sunset, of moon phases and weather patterns. They knew which direction the wind usually came from, which trees changed color first in autumn, where water gathered after rain. Their days had rhythm and purpose that had nothing to do with clocks or calendars. "I think we're learning how to pay attention," he said finally. Meanwhile, Dorothy was discovering that the house's peculiarities extended beyond mere architecture. She'd started a small garden in the terraced beds behind the house. Partly out of necessity, fresh vegetables would stretch their grocery budget, and partly out of curiosity about Margaret's abandoned plots. The soil was extraordinary, dark and rich, and alive with earthworms. It seemed to have been building fertility for decades. Seeds Dorothy planted sprouted almost overnight. Lettuce that should have taken 2 weeks to germinate was pushing through the soil in 4 days. "Harold, come see this," she called one morning, kneeling beside a bed where she'd planted winter vegetables 2 weeks earlier. Harold joined her, coffee cup in hand, and whistled softly. The small bed was a riot of green lettuce, spinach, radishes, and herbs, growing with almost supernatural vigor. "Dorothy, this lettuce is bigger than anything we could buy in the store." She pulled a radish from the soil, brushing dirt from its perfect red globe. "And look at this. It's been in the ground 12 days. Harold knelt beside her, examining the plants more closely. "The question is, why? What makes this soil so productive?" Dorothy had been wondering the same thing. She'd found Margaret's garden journals in a box in the storage room, detailed records of 50 years of organic gardening. The entries revealed a methodical approach to soil building that went far beyond simple composting. "Listen to this," Dorothy said, reading from one of Margaret's notebooks. Year 15, coffee grounds from Town Cafe, seaweed from Coast, aged manure from Morrison's Ranch, fallen leaves from Oak Grove. pH tested at 6.8, nitrogen levels optimal, beneficial bacteria thriving. 15 years? Harold asked. She documents 50 years of soil improvement. Look at this entry from year 30. Garden producing enough vegetables to supply 3 families. Soil biology creating its own ecosystem. Plants appear to be communicating through root networks. Harold laughed. Plants communicating? It sounds crazy, but Harold, look at how these vegetables are growing. They're not just healthy, they're extraordinary. As Dorothy worked in the garden each morning, she began to notice patterns that seemed to support Margaret's more unusual observations. Plants in one bed would suddenly flourish after she planted complementary species nearby. Root vegetables would grow larger and sweeter when she planted aromatic herbs between them. More mysteriously, she began to understand intuitively which plants wanted to grow where. A patch of ground that looked identical to every other patch would somehow feel wrong for tomatoes but perfect for beans. Another spot would call out for herbs, and when she planted them there, they would grow with remarkable vigor. "I think Margaret was right," she told Harold one evening, as they ate salad made entirely from their garden. "The plants are communicating somehow. Not with words, but with chemistry, with root connections, with something." Harold, who was still approaching their new life with an engineer's logic, remained skeptical. But he couldn't argue with results. In 6 weeks, Dorothy's small garden was producing more food than they could eat. The abundance affected their relationship with the house in unexpected ways. Instead of feeling isolated and vulnerable, they began to feel connected to something larger than themselves. Their daily routine revolved around the garden's needs, the sun's path, the weather's moods. Dorothy found herself waking before dawn, drawn to the kitchen windows to watch the sun rise over the hills. She'd make coffee on their camp stove and stand at the glass wall, watching the light change from pale gray to gold to brilliant white as it moved across the landscape. "It's like having a front-row seat to creation," she told Harold one morning, as they watched fog lift from the valley below, revealing patches of vineyards and oak groves. Harold had developed his own morning ritual. After splitting wood and tending the fire, he would walk the perimeter of the property, checking on trees, observing weather patterns, noting changes in the landscape. He'd started a notebook where he recorded daily observations: temperature, wind direction, cloud formations, animal activity. November 15th, he would write, "First frost. House retained heat until 6 a.m., despite outside temperature of 32 degrees. Deer track visible in frost, leading to Oak Grove. Red-tailed hawk, circling at 8:30. These observations began to reveal patterns that helped him understand how the house functioned. On clear nights, heat radiated away quickly, but the glass walls seemed to prevent heat loss through convection. On cloudy nights, the building held warmth longer. During storms, the structure actually seemed to gain energy, the glass panels somehow capturing and storing atmospheric electricity. "I think this house is more sophisticated than we realized," Harold told Dorothy one evening, after a particularly violent storm had somehow left them with fuller batteries than when it started. "Sophisticated how?" "I think it's designed to work with weather systems, not just shelter us from them. Look at what happened during that storm. Instead of losing power, we gained it." Dorothy had noticed the same thing. "And look what happened to the garden. After 3 days of rain, everything grew twice as fast." Harold consulted his notebook. "The rain here isn't just water, it's somehow charged, energized. And the soil isn't just soil. It's like a living system that gets activated by certain weather conditions." As winter deepened, their appreciation for the house's unusual qualities grew. What had seemed like impractical design choices began to reveal themselves as sophisticated adaptations to the local climate. The glass walls that provided no privacy also provided constant connection to the weather, allowing them to respond to changing conditions before those changes affected their comfort. The open floor plan that seemed so strange in urban terms made perfect sense in a building designed around a central heat source. Most remarkably, the house seemed to be teaching them how to live within natural limits without feeling deprived. They used less energy than they'd ever used in a conventional home, but they were more comfortable because they were working with natural systems rather than fighting them. "We're not trying to control our environment anymore," Dorothy observed one evening as they sat by the fire, reading by lamplight. "We're learning to dance with it." Harold looked up from James Holloway's biography, which he'd finally managed to obtain through interlibrary loan. Maybe that's what Holloway meant about collaboration. Not just the building collaborating with the environment, but the people inside collaborating with both. Outside, wind moved through the oak trees with a sound like distant music. Inside, the fire crackled softly behind glass doors that reflected their faces back to them, older faces than they'd carried to the city, but somehow more peaceful. The glass walls that had once made them feel exposed now made them feel connected, part of something larger and more beautiful than they'd ever imagined. Dorothy set down her mending and walked to the glass wall that faced east, where tomorrow's sunrise would begin the cycle again. In the distance, she could see lights from the nearest town, but they seemed as remote as stars. "Harold," she said softly, "I think we're home." He joined her at the window, slipping his arm around her waist. Below them, the garden waited under starlight, soil rich with 50 years of patient building, ready for spring planting that would feed them through another year. "Whatever people in town think about us living in a glass house," Harold said, "they don't understand that we're not just living in it. We're learning from it." Dorothy nodded, watching her breath fog the glass for just a moment before the panel's warmth cleared it again. Tomorrow she would clean that fog away, and the day after that, and the day after that. But tonight, it felt like the house breathing, alive and responsive, and somehow grateful to be lived in again. They'd thought they were inheriting a burden, a strange white elephant that no one else wanted. But standing in their transparent home under a ceiling of stars, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a landscape at rest, Dorothy and Harold were beginning to understand that they'd inherited something much more precious. A way of life that most of the world had forgotten was possible. What they didn't yet know was that they'd also inherited one of the most valuable pieces of residential architecture ever created in America. But that discovery would come later, along with the challenges and opportunities it would bring. For now, it was enough to be warm, to be fed by their own garden, to be sheltered by walls that hid nothing and revealed everything. It was enough to be home. The breakthrough came on a gray February morning when Harold was sitting in the Mendocino County Library, hunched over a stack of architectural journals from the 1970s. He'd been researching James Holloway for 3 months now, piecing together fragments of information like an archaeologist, reconstructing a lost civilization. Most of what he'd found had been frustratingly incomplete brief mentions in trade publications, a few awards for commercial buildings, obituaries that mentioned his innovative approach to environmental design, but provided little detail. Harold was beginning to think that Margaret's husband had been a talented but minor figure in California architecture when he opened a journal called Progressive Architecture from September 1975. The headline made his hands shake, "The Visionary We Lost Too Soon, Remembering James Holloway." Harold read the article twice before fully absorbing what it said. James Holloway hadn't been a minor architect. He'd been considered one of the most important sustainable design pioneers of his generation, a man whose work had influenced an entire movement toward environmental architecture. Holloway's untimely death in 1976, the article stated, robbed the architectural world of its most promising voice for ecological design. His few completed buildings demonstrate an understanding of environmental integration that wouldn't become mainstream until decades later. The article listed Holloway's known works: the Marin County School, that had become a model for energy-efficient educational buildings; the Sacramento office complex that still operated entirely on renewable energy; the Davis Community Center that had inspired a generation of sustainable public architecture. But it was the final paragraph that made Harold's pulse quicken. Rumors persist of a final residential project, a private house designed as Holloway's definitive statement about sustainable living. However, the location of this house, if it was indeed completed, remains unknown to architectural historians. Harold stared at the page until the librarian asked if he was feeling well. The house that architectural historians had been searching for was the house he and Dorothy slept in every night. The definitive statement about sustainable living that James Holloway had created was their home. He drove back to the glass house in a daze, the article photocopied and folded carefully in his shirt pocket. Dorothy was in the garden, harvesting vegetables for their lunch, when he pulled up the dirt road faster than usual. "Dorothy," he called, getting out of the car without turning off the engine. "Dorothy, you need to see this." She straightened up from the lettuce bed, wiping soil from her hands on a rag she kept tucked in her belt. "What is it?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." Harold unfolded the article and read the key passages aloud. Dorothy listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each sentence. "Harold," she said when he finished, "are you saying we're living in a lost masterpiece?" "I'm saying we're living in the lost masterpiece. The one architectural historians have been looking for since 1976. Dorothy sat down heavily on the garden bench Harold had built from fallen oak branches. "What does that mean for us?" Harold honestly didn't know, but over the next few days, as he continued his research with new urgency, the implications began to become clear. James Holloway's known buildings were now considered landmarks of sustainable architecture. The Marin School had been designated a historic site. The Sacramento office complex had been purchased by a tech company for $35 million, not because they needed office space, but because they wanted to own a piece of architectural history. "If our house is really Holloway's final work," Harold told Dorothy one evening as they sat by the fire, "it's potentially the most significant example of sustainable residential architecture ever built." Significant how? Significant as in priceless, significant as in museums would want to acquire it. Significant as in architectural students from around the world would want to study it. Dorothy looked around their transparent home, where she'd learned to live in harmony with weather and seasons, where every morning brought new understanding of how a building could work with natural forces rather than against them. "It doesn't feel like a museum piece," she said. "It feels like home." Maybe that's the point. Maybe Holloway designed it to be both. The first visitor arrived on a Tuesday in early March. Harold was splitting firewood when he heard an unfamiliar car engine struggling up their dirt road. A small Honda Civic, even older than theirs, emerged from the oak grove and pulled up beside their house. A young woman stepped out, looking around with the wide-eyed expression Dorothy remembered from their first visit. She was maybe 25, with short dark hair and the kind of paint-stained jeans that marked her as someone who worked with her hands. "Excuse me," the woman called, approaching Harold cautiously. "Are you the owners of this house?" "We are," Harold replied, setting down his axe. "Can I help you?" "My name is Alex Kim. I'm a graduate student in the architecture program at UC Berkeley. I'm working on my thesis about environmental design from the 1970s. She paused, looking up at the glass structure. "Is this really a James Holloway house?" Harold and Dorothy exchanged glances. They'd talked about what they would do if people started asking questions, but they hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "What makes you think it is?" Dorothy asked, joining them from the garden. Alex pulled a tablet from her backpack and showed them a photograph from an architectural journal. This picture was taken in 1976, just before Holloway died. The caption says it shows his final residential project under construction, but no one's known where it was located. She looked between the photograph and their house. The steel framework, the glass panel system, the integration with the hillside, This has to be the same building. Harold studied the photograph. It showed their house about 70% complete, with workers installing glass panels and Margaret standing to one side, watching the construction. "That's my great-aunt Margaret," Dorothy said softly, pointing to the figure in the photograph. Alex's eyes widened. "You're related to Margaret Holloway? She was married to James Holloway?" "She was my great-aunt. She left us the house when she died." For a moment, Alex just stared at them. Then she said, "Do you have any idea what you have here?" Dorothy gestured toward the house. "We're learning." Alex spent the next 3 hours examining every detail of the building with the intensity of a detective. She photographed the signature etched in the glass, measured the angles of the roof overhangs, and took careful notes about the way the building responded to changing light conditions. "This is extraordinary," she told them as they sat at Harold's handmade table, sharing coffee and vegetables from Dorothy's garden. "Everything architects are trying to figure out now about zero-energy buildings and climate-responsive design. Holloway solved those problems 50 years ago." She showed them examples of contemporary sustainable architecture on her tablet buildings that won awards for innovations that their house had been quietly demonstrating for decades. "Look at this house in Denmark," Alex said, swiping through photographs. "It won the International Prize for Sustainable Design last year for its passive solar heating system." "But your house was doing the same thing in 1976, only more elegantly." Harold looked at the Danish house, a stark, modern structure that seemed to fight against its landscape rather than work with it. "What's the difference?" he asked. "The difference is that contemporary architects are still thinking about sustainability as technology. Holloway was thinking about it as relationship. Your house doesn't just use solar energy, it collaborates with it." Alex pointed to the way their afternoon light was streaming through specifically angled glass panels, illuminating the interior without creating glare or overheating. "See how the light is coming in? Those panels are positioned to capture maximum solar gain in winter and reject it in summer. But it's not mechanical, it's architectural. The building itself knows what season it is." Over the following weeks, Alex became a regular visitor. She was working on her dissertation about lost sustainable buildings from the 1970s, and their house provided the perfect case study. In exchange for access to photograph and document the building, she helped Harold and Dorothy understand the sophisticated systems they'd been living with. "This ventilation system," Alex explained one afternoon, pointing to barely visible slots in the glass panels, "creates natural air circulation that keeps the house cool in summer without any mechanical systems. And these thermal masses," she gestured to the stone walls and concrete floors, "store heat during the day and release it at night." Dorothy watched Alex work with growing fascination. The young woman saw details that had become invisible through daily familiarity, the way water flowed across the glass during rain, cleaning the panels naturally, the way the building's orientation captured prevailing breezes in summer while blocking them in winter. "You're living in a prototype," Alex told them one evening as they watched sunset paint the glass walls gold and crimson. This house was Holloway's laboratory for ideas that are just now being rediscovered. But Alex's visits had an unintended consequence. Word began to spread through architectural circles that James Holloway's lost house had been found. Alex, despite promising discretion, couldn't resist sharing her discovery with professors and fellow students. Within a month, Harold and Dorothy started receiving phone calls from people they'd never heard of. The first call came from a journalist at Architectural Digest who wanted to do a feature story. Harold politely declined, but the calls kept coming. Graduate students requesting interviews, architectural photographers asking for permission to shoot the house, a documentary filmmaker who wanted to create a film about Holloway's work. "We're not ready for this," Dorothy told Harold, after declining the 5th media request in 2 days. "I don't think we'll ever be ready for this," Harold replied. "The question is whether we can control it, or whether it controls us." The pressure intensified when Robert Sterling returned. Harold was working in the garden on a warm April afternoon when a black SUV pulled up their dirt road. He recognized Sterling immediately, the real estate developer who'd called months earlier with an offer to buy their property for resort development. This time, Sterling wasn't alone. He stepped out of the SUV, followed by two men in expensive suits who looked around the property with calculating eyes. "Mr. Chen," Sterling said, approaching with the confident smile of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Beautiful afternoon. Mind if we walk around a bit?" "Actually, I do mind," Harold said, setting down his gardening tools. "This is private property." Of course. I just wanted to show my associates what we're dealing with here." Sterling gestured toward his companions. "This is Bill Morrison from Morrison Development and Jake Peterson from Coastal Properties. We're putting together a consortium to develop this entire area." Harold felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. Develop it into what? Luxury resort community. Golf course, spa, maybe a small airstrip for private jets. This area is ripe for high-end tourism, especially with the wine country so close. Sterling pointed toward the valley below. "We've already acquired options on most of the surrounding parcels. Your property is the key piece we need to make the project work. We told you before we're not interested in selling." Morrison, a heavy-set man with small eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. Chen, let's be realistic. You're living in what amounts to a greenhouse in the middle of nowhere. No offense, but this isn't a sustainable situation for people your age." "We're doing fine," Harold said. Peterson, younger and sharper, dressed, consulted a tablet. "Mr. Chen, we've done our research. Your property taxes are going up significantly next year due to reassessment. Your access road needs major repairs that the county won't pay for. You have no fire protection, no medical services nearby." He looked up from the tablet. "We're offering you a way out before these problems become unmanageable." Sterling nodded sympathetically. "Mr. Chen, we're prepared to offer you $500,000 cash for your property. That's more than enough to buy a nice condo in town and still have money left over for retirement." Harold looked at the three men standing in his garden. Their expensive shoes sinking slightly into the rich soil Dorothy had been building for months. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I appreciate your offer, but the answer is no. This is our home." The three men exchanged glances. Morrison stepped closer. "Mr. Chen, I think you should understand something. This development is going to happen with or without your cooperation. The county commissioners are very supportive. The environmental impact studies are already approved. Your little glass house is going to look pretty strange, surrounded by a luxury resort." "Is that a threat?" Harold asked. Sterling raised his hands in a peacekeeping gesture. "Not a threat, Mr. Chen, just reality. Change is coming to this area, whether you want it or not. We're giving you the chance to benefit from that change rather than be overwhelmed by it." After the developers left, Harold sat on the garden bench feeling older than his 72 years. Dorothy found him there an hour later, staring out over the valley that might soon be covered with golf courses and resort buildings. "What did they want?" she asked, though she could guess. Harold repeated the conversation. Dorothy listened without interruption, her expression growing more determined with each detail. "They think they can intimidate us into selling," she said when he finished. "Can they?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, looking at the garden where her vegetables were thriving in soil she'd been building one shovelful at a time, at the house that had taught them to live in harmony with natural rhythms they'd forgotten existed. "Harold, we've survived poverty, illness, and losing everything we thought we needed. Do you really think we can't survive a few men in expensive suits?" But the pressure intensified over the following weeks. Their property taxes did increase dramatically from $800 a year to over $3,000. The county suddenly declared their access road unsafe and demanded expensive repairs. A fire marshal appeared unannounced to inspect their wood-burning stove and declared it potentially hazardous, despite its having functioned safely for almost 50 years. "They're trying to make it too expensive for us to stay," Harold told Alex during one of her visits. "That's a common tactic," Alex replied. developers use regulatory pressure to force out property owners who won't sell voluntarily. Alex had become more than a research subject. She'd become an ally. Her enthusiasm for the house had evolved into genuine concern for Harold and Dorothy's welfare. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "there might be ways to protect the property. Historic designation, for instance. If we could get the house listed as a historic landmark, it would be much harder for developers to pressure you." "How would we do that?" Dorothy asked. "We'd need to document its significance, prove that it's an important example of sustainable architecture, show that it represents a unique contribution to American building design." Harold smiled grimly. "And how exactly do we prove that?" Alex grinned. "We start by getting some attention from people who understand what you have here." Despite their wariness of publicity, Harold and Dorothy agreed to let Alex arrange a small gathering of architecture professors and students to visit the house. If they were going to fight the developers, they needed allies who understood the building's significance. The gathering took place on a Saturday in early May. 8 people came: professors from UC Berkeley, a graduate student from Stanford, an architectural historian from San Francisco, and a journalist from a sustainable design magazine. Dorothy was nervous about having so many strangers in their home, but the visitors treated the house with something approaching reverence. They moved carefully through the space, speaking in hushed tones, examining details with the intensity of people encountering something they'd only read about. "The joinery alone is worth studying," said Professor Martinez from Berkeley, running her hand along the connection between a steel beam and glass panel. "This level of craftsmanship is almost impossible to find today." Dr. Williams, the architectural historian, was photographing the signature etched in the glass when he suddenly stopped. "My God," he said quietly. "Do you realize what this represents?" "What do you mean?" Harold asked. "This isn't just Holloway's final house. It's his masterwork, the building where he brought together everything he'd learned about sustainable design." Dr. Williams looked around the space with new appreciation. "This house is like finding a lost symphony by Beethoven." The journalist, a woman named Sarah Chen, interviewed Harold and Dorothy about their experience living in the house. Unlike the aggressive media requests they'd been declining, Sarah's questions focused on the practical aspects of sustainable living rather than the building's monetary value. "What's it like to live in harmony with natural cycles?" she asked as they sat in the garden, surrounded by vegetables that seemed to glow with health. "It's like remembering who we are," Dorothy replied. "We spent so many years fighting against weather and seasons, trying to control our environment. Here, we work with it instead. It's more peaceful." Harold nodded. "The house teaches you to pay attention. You notice things you never noticed before, how light changes throughout the day, how weather systems move across the landscape, how plants respond to different conditions. Do you feel isolated out here?" Sarah asked. Dorothy looked around at their garden, their transparent home, the oak trees that had become as familiar as old friends. "We felt isolated in the city," she said. "Surrounded by millions of people, but not really connected to anything. Here, we feel connected to everything: the land, the weather, the seasons, each other." The article that resulted from Sarah's visit appeared in Sustainable Design Quarterly 3 weeks later. It was thoughtful and respectful, focusing on Harold and Dorothy's transformation from urban poverty to rural self-sufficiency rather than on the house's potential value. But the article had unexpected consequences. Within days of its publication, Harold and Dorothy began receiving letters from around the world from people inspired by their story, from architects wanting to study the house, from individuals planning their own moves toward sustainable living. More significantly, the article caught the attention of the James Holloway Foundation, an organization Harold and Dorothy hadn't known existed. The foundation had been established by Holloway's colleagues after his death, dedicated to preserving examples of sustainable architecture and promoting environmental design principles. When they learned that Holloway's lost masterpiece had been found, they immediately reached out to Harold and Dorothy. "We'd like to help you protect the house," said Maria Santos, the foundation's director. during a phone call that would change everything, not just from developers, but for future generations. "This building is too important to lose." "What kind of help?" Dorothy asked. "Legal support for historic designation, financial assistance with preservation costs, documentation, and research support. And if you're interested, we could help you establish an education program that would allow people to learn from what Holloway created." Harold and Dorothy looked at each other across their kitchen table. 6 months ago, they'd been invisible old people struggling to pay rent on a studio apartment. Now, they were being offered support from an international foundation to preserve architectural history. "We'd like to stay here," Dorothy said. "This is our home." "Of course," Maria replied. "That's part of what makes it special. It's not a museum, it's a living demonstration of sustainable principles." But even as help arrived from unexpected sources, the pressure from developers continued to intensify. Harold discovered that Sterling's consortium had been buying up properties throughout the valley, often from elderly owners who couldn't afford rising tax assessments or necessary repairs. "They're systematically acquiring the entire area," Harold told Dorothy, after researching property transfers at the county recorder's office. "We're not just fighting for our house, we're fighting for the whole valley." The realization motivated them to reach out to their few neighbors, scattered though they were across the rural landscape. Harold and Dorothy had been so focused on their own adaptation to country living that they'd had little contact with other residents of the area. But as they began visiting neighboring properties, they discovered they weren't alone in their resistance to the development pressure. The Morrison Ranch, 5 miles down the valley, was facing bankruptcy due to increased property taxes. The elderly woman who ran the small organic farm near the main road was struggling to afford repairs demanded by newly aggressive county inspections. "They're squeezing all of us," said Tom Morrison, the third-generation rancher whose family had worked the land for 60 years. Trying to make it too expensive to stay, Harold and Dorothy began organizing informal meetings of area residents, gathering in each other's homes to share information and develop strategies for resistance. Dorothy, who'd never been politically active in her life, found herself helping neighbors fill out paperwork for tax appeals and historic preservation applications. "I never thought I'd become a community organizer at 70, she told Harold one evening after a particularly productive meeting at the organic farm. "I never thought we'd become anything other than invisible," Harold replied. "But maybe that's changing." Indeed, their presence in the valley was beginning to have effects they hadn't anticipated. Harold's expertise with mechanical systems led to requests for help from neighbors dealing with aging equipment. Dorothy's success with organic gardening inspired others to try sustainable growing methods. More significantly, their story was inspiring others to resist the development pressure. Property owners who might have accepted buyout offers were reconsidering, emboldened by Harold and Dorothy's example. "You showed us it's possible to live simply and be happy," Tom Morrison told them during one of their community meetings. "Made us remember why we want to stay on this land in the first place." The local newspaper, which had initially covered their move to the glass house as a curiosity, began writing about the broader community resistance to resort development. Harold and Dorothy found themselves quoted as spokespersons for a movement they hadn't meant to start. "We're not against progress," Dorothy was quoted as saying, "We're for progress that enhances life rather than destroys it." By late spring, the isolated elderly couple who'd moved to a worthless glass house had become the center of a community renaissance. Their weekly farmers market started simply to sell excess vegetables from Dorothy's extraordinary garden, had grown into a gathering place for sustainable living enthusiasts from throughout Northern California. Alex had graduated from occasional visitor to resident intern, spending most of her time at the house documenting Holloway's design principles and helping Harold and Dorothy prepare for what they all knew was coming. A much larger spotlight than any of them were ready for. "Are you prepared for what's going to happen when the world discovers what you have here?" Alex asked one evening as they sat on the hillside above the house, watching the building glow in the late afternoon light. Dorothy reached for Harold's hand, their fingers intertwining with the automatic comfort of almost 50 years of marriage. "We weren't prepared for any of this," she said, "but we're still here." Harold nodded, looking out over the valley where other lights were beginning to twinkle. Neighbors who'd decided to stay and fight. People who'd found their own ways to live sustainably and peacefully on the land. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we're not facing it alone anymore." Below them, the glass house caught and held the last light of the day, glowing like a beacon on the hillside, a symbol of the possibility that another way of living was not only possible but beautiful. What they didn't know was that within weeks, professional appraisers would arrive with news that would transform their quiet resistance into a global story about the true value of visionary architecture. But for now, it was enough to sit on their hillside, surrounded by the community they'd accidentally helped create, watching their transparent home prepare for another night of sheltering dreams that had grown far larger than anything they'd dared to imagine when they first turned that brass key in a door made of light. The final call came on a Tuesday morning in late June. Harold answered, expecting another architecture student, or perhaps Alex calling from UC Berkeley, but the voice on the other end was crisp and professional in a way that immediately commanded attention. "Mr. Chen, this is Margaret Torres from Sotheby's International Realty. I specialize in extraordinary properties, estates, historical landmarks, architecturally significant homes. I understand you have a James Holloway house." Harold had learned to be cautious about unexpected callers, especially after months of pressure from developers and increasing media interest. "What about it, Mr. Chen? I'd like to discuss the current market valuation of your property. Based on preliminary research and recent sales of comparable Holloway buildings, I believe you're sitting on something quite remarkable. We're not looking to sell. I understand completely. But Mr. Chen, you should know what you have for insurance purposes, for estate planning, for your own knowledge. Would you be willing to meet with me?" That afternoon, a silver BMW navigated their dirt road with surprising grace, somehow looking elegant despite the dust and potholes that had defeated many other vehicles. A woman in her 50s stepped out, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than Harold and Dorothy had spent on clothing in the past 5 years, but boots practical enough for rough ground. "Thank you for seeing me," Margaret Torres said, shaking their hands with the firm grip of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "I drove up from San Francisco specifically to see your house." She spent 2 hours touring the property with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. Unlike previous visitors who'd focused on the building's innovative features, Margaret Torres examined everything from an appraiser's perspective: the land, the access, the views, the privacy, the condition of every system. "Tell me about the property boundaries," she said, studying a survey map Harold had found among Margaret Holloway's papers. 12 acres, Harold replied, from the creek at the bottom of the hill to the ridgeline above the house. "Water rights?" "Included with the property. The well produces about 20 gallons per minute, tested annually." Margaret Torres nodded, making notes in a leather portfolio. "Development potential." Dorothy looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Whether the property can be subdivided, whether additional structures can be built, whether there are any restrictions on how the land can be used." Harold consulted the papers again. According to county zoning, it's designated for residential use with a minimum 5-acre requirement. Theoretically, the land could support 2 additional houses. Margaret Torres smiled in a way that suggested she'd just heard very good news. After the property tour, she sat with them at Harold's handmade oak table, spreading out documents and photographs that made Dorothy's head spin. "I need to explain some things," Margaret Torres began, opening a folder of professional photographs. "First, you should understand that your house isn't just a curiosity, or even just a significant architectural work. It's a documented masterpiece by one of the most important sustainable architects of the 20th century." She showed them photos of James Holloway's other surviving works. "This house in Marin County sold 18 months ago for $15 million. This office building in Sacramento was purchased by a technology company for $42 million. They weren't buying real estate, they were buying architectural art. Dorothy stared at the photographs, trying to process numbers that seemed to exist in a different universe from her careful budgeting and coupon clipping. 15 million? For a house? For a James Holloway house, in original condition, with complete documentation. Margaret Torres looked at them with the gravity of someone delivering life-changing news. Your house is not just a James Holloway design. According to my research, it's his final and most sophisticated work, completed just before his death. She paused to let this sink in. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, preliminary estimates suggest your property could be valued at somewhere between $70 and $100 million. The words hung in the air like something physical, visible but impossible to grasp. Dorothy reached for Harold's hand across the table, her fingers trembling. That can't be right, Harold whispered. It's not just the house, Margaret Torres continued gently. It's the completeness of the archive you've inherited. The original drawings, the correspondence between James and Margaret Holloway during construction, the photographic documentation of the building process, Margaret's 50 years of maintenance records. You have the most complete record of how a master architect created his definitive statement. She opened another folder. There's more. The land itself has become extraordinarily valuable. 12 acres of pristine California landscape with water rights and development potential within reasonable distance of San Francisco's tech economy. Even without the house, this land would be worth millions in today's market. Harold stood up abruptly, walking to the glass wall that looked out over the hillside where deer were grazing in the late afternoon light. The same deer he'd been watching for months, living their simple lives without any knowledge that the ground beneath their feet had just been declared worth a fortune. We bought groceries with coupons last year, he said quietly. We almost lost our apartment because we couldn't make rent. And now? Margaret Torres asked gently. Now you're telling us we're sitting on more money than most people see in a lifetime. Dorothy joined Harold at the window, slipping her arm around his waist. The garden she'd been tending stretched before them, heavy with summer vegetables, soil rich with decades of patient building. What do people do with houses worth $100 million? She asked. Usually, Margaret Torres said carefully, they sell them to people who have $100 million to spend on houses. Harold turned around. What? If we don't want to sell? Then you don't sell. But you should understand what you're choosing to keep and what that choice might mean for your future. Over the next hour, Margaret Torres explained the practical implications of owning what she called a museum-quality architectural artifact. Insurance would need to be adjusted dramatically. Their current homeowner's policy covered perhaps 1% of the property's actual value. Security would become a concern. While architectural enthusiasts weren't dangerous, publicity about the house's value could attract less benign attention. Most significantly, there would be tax implications. Property tax assessments based on market value rather than their current agricultural classification could easily run into hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. The county assessor will eventually learn about this valuation, Margaret Torres warned. When that happens, your property taxes could increase by a factor of 50 or more, meaning we could be taxed out of our own home. Dorothy said, it's possible, which is why many owners of extremely valuable properties explore options like conservation easements, historic preservation trusts, or educational partnerships that can provide tax benefits while protecting the asset. After Margaret Torres left, Harold and Dorothy sat in silence as evening fell around their transparent house. The interior lights made the glass walls seem to disappear, creating the illusion that they were floating in space surrounded by stars. I feel like we're characters in someone else's story, Dorothy said finally. Whose story? I don't know. Someone who wins the lottery but doesn't realize it until years later. Someone who finds treasure in their backyard but can't decide whether it's a blessing or a curse. Harold nodded, understanding the disorientation. Dorothy, what do we do? She was quiet for a long time, staring out at stars visible through the glass ceiling. I keep thinking about something Alex said, about how this house represents ideas that were 50 years ahead of their time. What about it? Maybe we're supposed to be its guardians. Not its owners, but its protectors. Maybe Margaret Holloway kept it safe all those years, so it would be here when the world was ready to understand it. Harold considered this. And you think the world is ready now? I think the world needs it now. Everything we've learned about living here, about using less energy, growing our own food, living in harmony with natural cycles, isn't that what everyone's trying to figure out? Harold understood what she was suggesting. You're talking about sharing it with the public. I'm talking about teaching what we've learned. About showing people that you can live beautifully without destroying the planet. About proving that James Holloway's ideas aren't just museum pieces, they're solutions. They talked deep into the night, weighing possibilities that seemed equally overwhelming. They could sell the property and live comfortably anywhere in the world for the rest of their lives. They could keep it private and continue their quiet existence on the hillside. Or they could find a way to share it carefully, thoughtfully, with people who might learn from what James Holloway had created and what they had discovered about living within it. What would we call it? Harold asked as they finally prepared for bed. Call what? If we opened it to the public somehow, what would we call it? Dorothy smiled. The glass house. Nothing more complicated than that. The place where people come to learn how to live. The next morning brought a phone call that helped clarify their path. Alex was calling from UC Berkeley with news that made their decision feel inevitable. Harold, Dorothy, I have extraordinary news. The James Holloway Foundation wants to partner with you. What kind of partnership? Dorothy asked, with Alex on speakerphone. They want to help you establish the house as a research and education center. They'd provide funding for visitor facilities, educational programs, conservation of the building and archives. You'd remain the legal owners and residents, but the foundation would help you share it with the world while preserving its integrity. Harold and Dorothy looked at each other across the breakfast table where they'd been reading Margaret Torres's valuation report. For the third time. Would we still live here? Dorothy asked. Absolutely. That's part of what makes it special. It's not a museum. It's a living demonstration of how these design principles work in daily life. Alex continued with growing excitement. The foundation is prepared to offer substantial support enough to cover property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and operational costs for an educational program. Plus, they want to help you apply for historic landmark status, which would provide additional protections and tax benefits. After Alex hung up, Harold and Dorothy walked through their transparent house, seeing it as if for the first time. Sunlight streamed through the eastern walls, warming the stone floors that would hold that heat until evening. The garden outside was heavy with late summer vegetables they'd learned to grow in Margaret's miraculous soil. The rainwater cisterns were full, the solar batteries charged, the wood stove ready for winter. It's not really ours, is it? Dorothy said, running her hand along the smooth glass wall that separated inside from outside, while somehow connecting them. What do you mean? Something this beautiful, this important, it belongs to everyone. We just get to be the ones who live in it. Harold nodded slowly. Like we're the caretakers, like we're the lucky ones who get to show it to the world. But before they could implement their plans, news of the house's valuation leaked to the media in ways they hadn't anticipated. Margaret Torres had been discreet, but property records were public, and a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle had been following the story of James Holloway's rediscovered masterpiece. The headline that appeared 3 days later changed everything. Hidden treasure. Elderly couples, worthless inheritance, worth $80 million. Harold's phone started ringing at 6 in the morning and didn't stop. Every major news network wanted interviews. Architectural publications that had ignored their story when it was about sustainable living suddenly demanded exclusive access now that it involved astronomical monetary values. Good Morning America wants to do a live broadcast from the house, Harold told Dorothy, after declining his 15th media request of the day. 60 Minutes wants an exclusive interview. Someone from the Today Show is driving up from San Francisco right now without an appointment. Dorothy looked out at their dirt road, where 3 news vans were already parked. Reporters and camera crews setting up equipment, despite having no permission to be on their property. "This is insane," she said. "Yesterday we were just 2 old people living quietly in a glass house. Today we're supposedly millionaires being hunted by television crews." Harold disconnected his phone and sat beside her on the bench he'd built from fallen oak. "Dorothy, we need to make some decisions quickly, or other people are going to make them for us." The pressure came from multiple directions. Robert Sterling called within hours of the Chronicle article appearing, his tone completely different from previous conversations. "Mr. Chen, I assume you've seen the news coverage. Obviously, our previous offer is no longer relevant. I'd like to discuss a partnership that could benefit everyone involved." Harold hung up without responding, but Sterling wasn't the only one with renewed interest in their property. By the end of the day, they'd received calls from museum directors, real estate investment firms, technology executives, and even a representative of a foreign government interested in acquiring the house for a cultural center. "Everyone wants to own us," Dorothy said that evening as they sat by their fire, having unplugged their phone and closed their curtains against the news crews still camped on their road. "No one wants to understand us," Harold replied. "They want to possess what we have, but they don't want to learn how we live." That's when they knew their path forward with certainty. The next morning, Harold and Dorothy called Alex and asked her to set up a meeting with the James Holloway Foundation immediately. They also called Margaret Torres and asked her to help them establish legal protections for the property that would prevent forced sale or development. "We want to stay," Dorothy told Maria Santos, the foundation director, during a conference call that would reshape their future. "And we want to share what we've learned. But we want to do it right." "What does right mean to you?" Maria asked. "It means the house remains a home, not just a museum," Harold said. "It means people can learn by seeing how these principles work in daily life, not just by reading plaques on walls. It means we protect the land and the community, not just the building," Dorothy added. "The developers who want to turn this valley into a resort, that can't happen." Maria Santos listened carefully. "I think we can help you achieve all of those goals. The foundation has experience creating residential education centers that preserve both architectural heritage and community integrity." Over the following weeks, working with lawyers provided by the foundation, Harold and Dorothy established the Glass House Center for Sustainable Living. The legal structure they created was innovative. They retained ownership and residence rights while placing the property under a conservation easement that prevented development and provided enormous tax benefits. The foundation provided funding for minimal visitor facilities, a small parking area discreetly located beyond the oak grove, restrooms, and a meeting space built into the hillside, so they wouldn't compete visually with Holloway's masterpiece, and pathways through the garden that allowed groups to experience the landscape without damaging it. Most importantly, they designed an educational program that reflected their own journey of discovery. Visitors wouldn't just tour the house, they'd participate in workshops about sustainable living, learn about organic gardening in Margaret's soil, understand how buildings could work with natural systems rather than against them. "The goal isn't to turn people into us," Dorothy explained to the first group of architecture students who came for a weekend intensive program. "It's to show people that there are many ways to live well without taking more than you need." Harold had become the center's expert on building systems and renewable energy. His workshops on solar power, rainwater collection, and passive heating drew everyone from high school students to professional architects. "The house teaches you," he would tell groups as they examined the way afternoon light streamed through precisely angled glass panels. "You don't impose systems on it, you discover what it wants to do naturally and work with that." Dorothy's garden programs became equally popular. She taught people about soil building, companion planting, and the patience required to work with natural cycles rather than fighting them. "This soil took 50 years to develop," she would tell visitors, kneeling beside the raised beds where vegetables grew with almost supernatural vigor. Margaret Holloway spent half a century learning how to collaborate with this particular piece of earth. That's the real lesson, not the techniques, but the commitment to paying attention. 6 months after the Glass House Center opened officially, it had a waiting list 6 months long. Requests came from universities, environmental organizations, architecture firms, and individuals planning their own sustainable living experiments. But perhaps the most meaningful change was what happened to the surrounding community. The attention focused on the Glass House had brought new awareness to the entire valley's unique character. Property values increased, but in ways that benefited existing residents rather than displacing them. Tom Morrison, the third-generation rancher who'd been facing bankruptcy, discovered that his family's sustainable farming practices, dismissed for years as old-fashioned, were now considered cutting-edge. He began offering workshops on regenerative agriculture that complemented the Glass House programs. The elderly woman who ran the organic farm near the main road found herself overwhelmed with demand for her vegetables from restaurants in San Francisco that wanted to feature locally grown, sustainably produced food. Even the weekly farmers market that had started as a way for Dorothy to sell excess garden produce had evolved into a regional destination that brought visitors and revenue throughout the valley. "You started something?" Tom Morrison told Harold and Dorothy during a community celebration held in their garden on the first anniversary of the center's opening. "Not just the education center, but this whole idea that we could stay here and thrive without selling out to developers." Harold looked around at the gathering neighbors who'd lived in the valley for generations, mixing with visitors from around the world, children playing among vegetables, while their parents discussed solar panel installations and permaculture techniques. "We didn't start anything," he said. "We just stopped running away from who we were meant to be." Dorothy nodded, watching Alex demonstrate rainwater collection techniques to a group of teenagers from a San Francisco environmental club. "For so many years, we thought survival meant making ourselves smaller, taking up less space, needing less," she said. "We never imagined that our way of living could become something other people wanted to learn from." As evening approached and the visitors prepared to leave, Harold and Dorothy climbed the hillside above their house for the perspective they'd come to treasure. Below them, the glass structure glowed softly in the sunset, no longer a curiosity or oddity, but recognized around the world as a masterpiece of environmental design. More importantly, it glowed as home to them, to the programs that filled it with learning and laughter, to the community that had grown up around it, to the vision of sustainable living that it represented. "Do you ever regret it?" Harold asked, settling beside Dorothy on the bench where they'd made so many important decisions. "Giving up the quiet? Sharing our private space?" Dorothy considered this, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead, hunting in the golden light that had first captured her attention almost 2 years ago. "I thought I would," she said. "But Harold, we were never really private before. We were just invisible. Now people see us, but they see us as teachers, as examples. They see us as proof that there's another way to live." Harold nodded, understanding. Below them, the last visitor cars were winding down their dirt road, carrying people back to their own lives with new ideas about what was possible. Dorothy added with a smile, "We still have the starlight. Every night, when everyone goes home, we still have the stars." That evening, after the facility had closed and the last educational group had departed, Harold and Dorothy sat by their fire as they had for countless evenings since moving to the Glass House. But now their solitude felt different, not like isolation, but like a gathering of energy, preparing for tomorrow's opportunities to share what they'd learned. Through the transparent walls, they could see lights beginning to twinkle throughout the valley, other houses, other families, other people who'd found ways to live sustainably on the land. Their glass house sat on the hillside like a lighthouse, its warm glow visible for miles, a reminder that beauty and sustainability weren't opposites, but partners. "Thank you," Dorothy said quietly. "For what?" for believing we could do this, for not thinking I was crazy when I wanted to move to a glass house in the middle of nowhere." Harold smiled, reaching for her hand. "Dorothy, you've never been crazy. You've just always been ahead of the rest of us." A year later, a documentary about their story premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. The Glass House, a love story, followed their journey from urban poverty to stewardship of an architectural masterpiece. But more than that, it captured their transformation from invisible elderly people to teachers and community leaders. The film's final scene showed them in their garden at sunset, surrounded by visitors from around the world, all learning about sustainable living from two people who'd discovered that transparency wasn't vulnerability, it was honesty, the courage to live openly and share what they'd learned. "We thought we were inheriting a burden," Dorothy said in the closing interview, "a strange house that no one else wanted. But we were really inheriting an opportunity to become the people we were meant to be." Harold nodded, his arm around his wife of 50 years. "Sometimes the best inheritance isn't money or property. Sometimes it's the chance to discover your purpose, to find out that you have something valuable to offer the world." As the camera pulled back, the glass house glowed in the twilight. Surrounded by the garden Dorothy had built and the community that had grown up around their story, it no longer looked like an oddity or an experiment. It looked like what it had always been, a vision of how humans could live in harmony with the natural world, finally recognized and celebrated by people ready to learn. Harold and Dorothy Chen had thought they were buying shelter with their last $5,000 and the inheritance of a worthless house. Instead, they discovered they were inheriting a masterpiece worth $80 million. But more than that, they'd inherited something priceless, the opportunity to prove that courage, perseverance, and the willingness to see beauty where others see worthlessness can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Anyone can find treasure if they're brave enough to look beyond the surface, patient enough to learn from what they find, and generous enough to share their discoveries with the world. As the morning sun began its daily journey across their transparent home, Harold and Dorothy Chen woke not to alarm clocks or worry about rent, but to the sound of birdsong and the knowledge that they'd become proof of something important, that it's never too late to start over, never too late to discover your purpose, and never too late to transform what seems like loss into the most beautiful kind of victory. The elderly couple who once counted pennies and clipped coupons had become stewards of architectural history and teachers of sustainable living. But most importantly, they'd become themselves fully, finally, and with a transparency that had nothing to do with glass walls and everything to do with the courage to live authentically in a world that celebrates the genuine article. Because for Harold and Dorothy, and for everyone whose lives they'd touched, home wasn't about the walls that hide you from the world. It was about the light that lets the world see who you really are. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories about finding treasure in the most unexpected places and discovering that sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest gifts. Click to continue the journey, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe that patience, courage, and the willingness to see beauty where others see worthlessness can change everything.